On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about the office where this story begins. Rows of desks, muted lighting, the low hum of routine productivity. It was the kind of place designed to fade into the background, where days blended together and people were known more for their roles than their inner lives. And for years, Rashad Purnell blended in perfectly. He arrived on time, completed his work, and interacted with coworkers politely, even cautiously. There were no recorded arguments, no formal complaints, no visible signs of instability. To most people around him, Rashad was simply another employee navigating deadlines, meetings, and quiet professional ambition. Nothing about his presence suggested that violence was taking shape just beneath the surface. But after one of his co-workers was murdered, investigators began searching for answers that the office itself could not provide. They reviewed emails, schedules, performance records, anything that might explain how a workplace without obvious conflict could become the setting of a homicide. What they found instead was something far more unsettling. Not a single explosive moment, but a slow, private unraveling that had gone unnoticed for years. Hidden away from colleagues and supervisors were journals written by Rashad himself. Page after page revealed a parallel reality, one built on suspicion, fixation, and an unshakable belief that someone close to him was actively working to destroy his future. These writings did not describe sudden rage. They documented a gradual shift, where ordinary workplace interactions were reinterpreted as threats, and professional disappointment became proof of conspiracy. This case is not defined by chaos or obvious warning signs. It is defined by silence, by how easily obsession can disguise itself as professionalism, and by how a quiet desk can conceal a mind slowly separating from reality, until belief turns into action, and normalcy collapses without warning. Rashad Purnell did not stand out in the way people often expect when they hear the word killer. He was employed, educated, and generally regarded as dependable. In performance reviews and workplace records, his name appeared without warning flags, no disciplinary actions, no written conflicts, no documented volatility. To supervisors, he was competent. To coworkers, he was reserved but courteous. The kind of person who didn't draw attention and rarely invited questions. He worked in a structured office environment where ambition was common and competition was subtle. Promotions were limited, recognition was measured, and success often depended on perception as much as output. Rashad appeared invested in his career path, taking his responsibilities seriously and expressing interest in advancement. On the surface, his goals were ordinary, even expected. What no one could see was how deeply his sense of identity had become tied to professional validation. Outside of work, Rashad maintained a largely private life. There were no dramatic social media posts, no public outbursts, no obvious signals that something was wrong. Friends and acquaintances would later describe him as quiet, introspective, and sometimes distant, but not alarming. If anything, he seemed like someone who kept his thoughts to himself. And for a long time, that privacy worked in his favor. What ultimately separated Rashad from those around him was not behavior, but interpretation. The same workplace experiences others viewed as routine, missed opportunities, feedback, everyday friction, began to take on exaggerated meaning in his mind. While his exterior remained controlled, his internal narrative was becoming increasingly rigid and increasingly distorted. At beyond the evidence, this is where the focus always begins. Not with the crime itself, but with the human context that allows it to form. If you're new to the channel, this is where we slow down, look past headlines, and examine what often goes unseen. Because understanding cases like this isn't about excusing harm, it's about recognizing how easily warning signs can be missed when they don't look like danger. Rashad Purnell and his co-worker occupied the same professional space, but their relationship never extended beyond what the job required. They worked in overlapping roles, attended some of the same meetings, and contributed to similar projects, yet there was no record of personal closeness or overt conflict. To outside observers, theirs was a routine workplace dynamic, polite, functional, and largely unremarkable. Co-workers would later describe interactions between the two as neutral. There were no heated exchanges, no visible rivalries, no moments that stood out in memory. In fact, many struggled to recall specific interactions at all. That absence of memory became significant in hindsight, because it highlighted how one-sided the emotional weight of the relationship truly was. Inside Rashad's journals, however, his co-worker occupied an outsized presence. What appeared to others as normal collaboration was reframed in his writing as competition. Casual comments were interpreted as veiled insults. Shared projects became battlegrounds where Rashad believed credit was being deliberately redirected away from him. Over time, his co-workers stopped being a colleague and became a central figure in a personal narrative of threat and injustice. This imbalance is what makes the case especially unsettling. The fixation existed almost entirely in isolation. While Rashad tracked perceived slights and imagined patterns of sabotage, the person at the center of those beliefs remained unaware. There was no escalation in the real-world relationship because, from the outside, there was no relationship changing at all. Proximity without intimacy allowed the obsession to grow unchecked. The coworker became a symbol rather than a person, someone onto whom Rashad projected frustration, ambition, and fear. And because that dynamic played out quietly, within the boundaries of normal office behavior, it went unnoticed by everyone except the person writing it down. The earliest journal entries do not describe anger or violence. They describe confusion. Rashad began writing about moments at work that left him unsettled. Meetings where his ideas didn't receive the response he expected, projects that moved forward without his name attached, feedback that felt dismissive rather than constructive. At first, these entries read like private attempts to process disappointment. Over time, the tone shifted. Rashad started returning to the same events repeatedly, reanalyzing them through a narrowing lens. A coworker's success was no longer coincidence but evidence. A delayed response became intentional avoidance. He began documenting patterns he believed proved his coworker was quietly undermining him. These interpretations were not shared with anyone else. They existed only in his writing, reinforcing themselves without challenge. What stands out to investigators is how subtle these changes were. There were no explicit threats, no declarations of hatred. Instead, there was an increasing certainty. Rashad's journals show him moving from questioning what was happening to asserting that he understood the truth of it. He wrote as though he had uncovered something hidden, something others were too naive to see. This period marks the inciting shift, from frustration to fixation. His coworker was no longer just part of the workplace environment, but the focal point of a growing belief system. Rashad began framing himself as a victim of deliberate sabotage, someone forced to remain silent while his future was being stolen piece by piece. These entries were the early warning signs, though no one was there to read them at the time. The danger wasn't in any single thought, but in how consistently those thoughts pointed in the same direction. A story was forming, and Rashad was no longer questioning whether it was true. He was documenting it as fact. As the months passed, Rashad's journal entries grew more rigid and more urgent. The uncertainty that once marked his writing was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose. He no longer documented events to understand them, but to catalog evidence. In his mind, the case against his coworker had already been proven. What remained was vigilance. He began writing about watching more closely, tracking schedules, noting changes in routine, paying attention to who spoke to whom, and when. These observations were framed as necessary precautions, not intrusions. Rashad believed he was responding to a threat, not creating one. His journals described late-night visits near places connected to his coworker, moments he justified as attempts to confine patterns or stay ahead. To him, these were defensive acts. The language in his writing also changed. Entries became increasingly coded, filled with phrases that suggested warning and inevitability. Rashad wrote as though messages were being exchanged beneath the surface of ordinary life, signals only he could interpret. Silence from others was no longer neutral, it was confirmation. The absence of confrontation became proof that something covert was underway. The final escalation came with the failed promotion. For Rashad, this moment did not exist in isolation. It fit perfectly into the narrative he had been constructing for years. In his journals, the denial was described not as a professional setback, but as the final outcome of long-term sabotage. Any remaining ambiguity collapsed. What he had suspected was now, in his mind, undeniable. From that point forward, Rashad's writing reflects a narrowing sense of options. He framed himself as cornered, someone whose future had been systematically erased. Investigators later noted how the journals shifted from observation to justification, as though he were preparing himself for an act he believed was unavoidable. The crime itself occurred without the chaos people expect from workplace violence. There was no public outburst, no warning scene. One coworker was killed, and Rashad was taken into custody. The violence was sudden, but it was not impulsive. It was the endpoint of a belief system that had been rehearsed in private, reinforced over time, and never interrupted. In the hours after the crime, the workplace fell into a state of disbelief. Employees were evacuated, desks left untouched, computers still logged in, personal items frozen in place. What had been a familiar environment only moments earlier now felt foreign and unsafe. For many, the most difficult question wasn't how the crime happened, but how it could have happened there. Co-workers struggled to reconcile the violence with their memories of Rashad Parnell. He had not raised his voice, not caused disruptions, not been the subject of concern. People replayed ordinary interactions in their minds, searching for something they might have missed. The absence of obvious warning signs became its own source of distress, leaving behind a sense of collective unease. The victim's death rippled outward, affecting families, colleagues, and an organization forced to confront a reality it had never anticipated. Grief mixed with confusion. There were no clear motives available yet, no explanation that made the loss feel comprehensible. In the immediate aftermath, the crime felt senseless, not because it lacked cause, but because that cause had remained invisible. Public reaction followed a similar pattern. Early reports focused on the shock value of a workplace homicide and the perceived randomness of the act. Rashad's demeanor in custody, calm, controlled, only deepened the mystery. Without context, the case appeared to be an unexplainable rupture in an otherwise normal professional setting. It would take time for the narrative to shift. Answers were not going to come from the crime scene itself, but from the slow work of investigation. And as authorities began examining Rashad's private writings, the focus moved away from what happened in that moment, toward what had been unfolding quietly for years. As investigators moved beyond the crime scene, their attention turned to understanding Rashad Purnell's state of mind. What they uncovered were multiple journals, meticulously kept, chronologically ordered, and spanning several years. These writings quickly became central to the investigation, not because they offered a confession, but because they revealed the internal logic that had guided Rashad's actions long before the violence occurred. Forensic psychologists and therapists were brought in to review the material. What emerged was a detailed record of progressive psychological distortion. Early entries showed mild suspicion and professional insecurity, but later pages reflected a fixed belief system resistant to contradiction. Rashad was no longer reacting to events as they happened. He was filtering everything through a pre-existing narrative of persecution. Neutral facts were reorganized to support a single conclusion. One of the most striking findings was how consistently Rashad positioned himself as rational and restrained. He did not describe emotional outbursts or loss of control. Instead, he wrote as though he were exercising discipline, observing, documenting, preparing. The journals revealed a man who believed he was thinking clearly, while his reasoning grew increasingly detached from shared reality. Investigators noted how the co-worker's role evolved within the writing. Over time, the individual ceased to be a colleague and became a symbolic antagonist. The journals contained no evidence of actual misconduct, yet Rashad treated his conclusions as established truth. This gap between belief and evidence became one of the defining features of the case. Ultimately, the journals reframed the crime entirely. What first appeared to be a sudden act of violence was now understood as the final step in a long, internal process. The investigation revealed not just what Rashad did, but how unnoticed psychological decay, left unchallenged and unexamined, can solidify into certainty, and certainty into catastrophe. With the journals fully examined and the investigation complete, the case moved into its final phase. Rashad Purnell was held legally responsible for the murder of his co-worker. The presence of documented psychological deterioration did not remove accountability, but it did shape how the crime was understood within the justice system. The focus shifted from mystery to consequence. Mental health evaluations played a central role in the proceedings. Experts outlined how Rashad's thinking had become increasingly delusional, yet also noted his ability to function within daily life. He had maintained employment, followed routines, and concealed his internal beliefs effectively. This duality complicated the narrative, reinforcing that mental illness does not exist in a single, easily identifiable form. Beyond the courtroom, the case prompted difficult conversations about workplace awareness and intervention. Colleagues and administrators questioned what responsibility institutions hold when warning signs are internal rather than behavioral. There were no clear policy failures to point to, only the uncomfortable reality that some forms of psychological decline are nearly invisible until harm occurs. For the victim's family, the outcome offered a form of closure without resolution. Accountability did not restore what was lost, nor did explanations soften the impact of the crime. The consequences extended beyond sentencing, leaving behind a permanent absence and a reminder of the limits of prevention. This case ultimately resisted simple conclusions. It demonstrated that understanding cause does not equal excusing harm. Rashad's actions remained his own, even as the circumstances surrounding them revealed how thin the line can be between unnoticed deterioration and irreversible consequence. When cases like this reach their conclusion, there's often a temptation to look backward and search for a single moment where everything could have changed. A conversation that didn't happen. A sign that went unnoticed. But the truth is more uncomfortable. Rashad Parnell did not unravel in public. His decline took place quietly, within the boundaries of normal life, where distress didn't announce itself and certainty felt like clarity. This case forces a confrontation with how limited our perception really is. Workplaces are designed to measure performance, not inner stability. Politeness can conceal fixation. Routine can hide obsession. And when harm finally occurs, it often feels sudden only because the warning signs were never visible to anyone else. There are no easy lessons here, and no guarantees. Awareness does not mean control, and understanding does not mean prevention. What remains is the responsibility to take psychological strain seriously, even when it doesn't fit familiar patterns, and to acknowledge that some dangers develop in silence. At Beyond the Evidence, the goal is not to provide answers that feel complete, but to ask questions that matter. What does responsibility look like when deterioration is private? How should institutions respond to risks they cannot see? And how do we balance compassion with accountability when belief replaces reality? If this case stayed with you, consider sharing your thoughts below. Not to assign blame, but to reflect on what often goes unnoticed, and what, if anything, could be done differently.